Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing great today and enjoyed these stories. Make sure you check out my Patreon if you want to support my channel and get early access to my stories, and make sure you check out my podcast, which is also in the description below. I have a quick message before the story starts, so for today I'd like to share this. It's something somebody told me a while ago, and it kind of leads on to what I was saying in my last video, but I think that when it comes to pressure, sometimes a good way to visualize it is like you're a jug, and every time you add more pressure and stress in, it's like adding water into the jug, and obviously there's going to be a limit before it overflows, so you want to try and catch it before it gets to that point and start to take off some pressure where you can and make sure you have the balance of things, because that's what's going to give you a healthy lifestyle and will make you your best version of yourself to be able to overcome the things in front of you. I know it serves me very well when I remember it, so I hope somebody else can get the same kind of strength I do from it. So yeah, I hope you'll enjoy these stories and I'll speak to you all soon. Take care. When I was young, probably 5 or 6, my family went camping. At the tippy top of the mountain, you really couldn't get any higher on said mountain. There was a lake that we were camping next to, so of course my family was fishing, so my mum and dad and uncle and I went to the shore to try and get some fish. Across the shore, on the other side of the small lake, my dad notices a massive brown/black humanoid figure just standing still and facing right at us. It had to be about 8+ feet tall, maybe even taller since it was so far away. So like any human naturally would, my dad starts yelling at it, since he had thought that it was a prank of some sort. I don't remember what my dad said, but I remembered the sound of the creature coming back. It wasn't anything we understood, it made kind of an unintelligible screech. It did somehow sound like it knew what it was saying, if that made sense, like he was saying something to us in only his own language. We are really confused and staring at this point. My grandparents and big brother has joined us now. I remembered my parents were attempting to recreate the screeches he was saying, and he would respond. This went on for a couple of minutes. The creature then took off, and I mean took off. Mind you, the entire time he was on 2 feet, much like a human. He turned and starts running towards the forest and was out of sight in seconds. He had been running at like 30 miles per hour. My brother, grandpa and dog tried chasing it and went to where they saw him, but he left. They did find a huge lump of black hair that was stuck in the barbed wire, although I'm not certain it come from the same creature. Tell me why we didn't leave. We spent the night still in our tents. It's very windy and I don't think anyone's able to sleep. I think about it from time to time, but it honestly is rare for any kind of encounter of that nature in Utah. I've seen UFOs, my siblings have seen what they think are skinwalkers, but that thing was different. So, this happened about 8 years ago now. I'm putting the words to paper to speak on behalf of my brother who was there that night. Now my brother and his friends were walking back home through the woods. They all heard the snap of a branch. When they turned around to see who it is, they could see the silhouette of a person on the top of the hill about 100 meters away from where they just walked down. They watched as it quickly tried to hide behind a tree. My brother and his friends all ask each other if they've just seen that, to which they all reply yeah. As they all continue to stare, my brother's eye finally manages to focus within the difficult lighting, as it was nighttime and dark. He describes that he can see a head peeking from behind the tree, but in an unusual way. It seemed to be tall, and the motion of the head moving was different. This is when it gets terrifying. Things step out now for worse, and something come from the top of the hill, almost as if it decides that I've been seen and I need to do something type of attitude, almost like fight or flight. My brother said that this is when the overwhelming fear kicks in because they could see the build of that thing and it's not a person. He described it as being tall, skinny waist, lanky long arms and having your typical alien-shaped head. And now, to make things worse, the thing steps down and charges down the hill into the surrounding by the trees where my brother and his friends are. He also said that the pace of the creature was definitely not human because of how quickly it gained ground. So obviously, my brother and his friends turned trail and start running for what feels like their lives. He did not want to turn around, and he looked like he was completely focused on getting away. My brother said, as they're running, they could hear it stumble now and again. They could also hear footsteps somewhat gaining on them at a pretty good pace. As they approach a village, they come to the end of the field where a street lamp glows onto the edge of the field. He said once they're into the light, the creature comes to an abrupt stop, as if scared by the light or to not be entirely revealed. My brother and his friends keep running until they get home. I asked my brother about the incident and he still expresses how scary it is. Now, my brother and I love wild camping, and one day we were going to camping and we suddenly began talking about the night. We ended up not going camping because we creeped each other out so badly. I'm ex-military, so I've done my fair share of sleeping and camping in the woods. I mean, that's how scary it is. And the level of detail and fear in my brother's voice let me know how real it was and how terrifying what actually happened is. Now firstly, I will state that I've never been interested in aliens or UFOs. I've honestly always been pretty scared of the whole thing. I remembered seeing signs when I was like 12, and it literally terrified me for weeks. But I thought of this stuff, this phenomena, as science fiction until I experienced something that I presume most of you won't be able to believe, and that's fine. I'm posting my story here because I haven't talked to anybody about it at all and feel the need to get it out there. 3 months ago, I was camping with a friend in a very remote part of Northern California in a massive wilderness. Now, I've been camping all my life and spent lots of my free time hiking, rock climbing and hunting, etc. Now, a buddy of mine that also enjoys the outdoors wanted us to head up to the Sierras for a weekend and said can I accompany him. It was our second night and we were sitting by a fire setting up. We weren't staying at the campsite. We had hiked about 10 miles from our cars up to a clearing with a beautiful view, which he stayed at once before. It's around 10 PM. We ate some food and were checking the stars. He was tired and went to sleep in his tent. I wanted to stay up for a while, and about 45 minutes after he went to bed, I saw this object coming up from the valley below. It was a basic flying saucer shape with multiple circular lights rotating around the edges that changed colour over and over. I was shocked, honestly. I watched it for maybe 15 seconds and then decided that I had to wake him up so he could see it and wouldn't think I was crazy. I stood there and looked back up towards it, but the thing was gone. I called out his name, and that's when everything got really messed up. I didn't hear my own voice when calling. Everything goes silent. I could move my eyes around but not my body. I remembered seeing the fire had completely frozen and everything almost looks like it's in a picture, like time had stopped or something. There was a flash of light and then I blacked out. I woke up later, just as the sun was starting to rise. I'm now outside laying in the dirt shivering next to the fire that's long gone. I felt like I'd been drugged and was totally in a haze. I really sluggishly yelled out his name a couple of times and he come out of the tent. He's very confused. Now, I try and explain what happened but my memory was really foggy and I couldn't articulate it. We left within 30 minutes. I was totally silent on the car ride back, falling in and out of sleep for about 7 hours. Eventually he drops me off at home and I pass out for basically the whole day. A few weeks later, I was messing around with the amp and heard this static sound, and somehow it triggered my memory and I remembered everything. When I come back into consciousness, I was suspended laterally in this circular mechanism in a position very similar to Da Vinci's Virtuven Man. These clear glass-like shackle-type restraints are holding me there. I was completely nude, and standing above me were 3 of your typical greys. They were around 4 feet tall and wearing white kind of suits. 2 were standing there observing, and 2 were extracting blood from my veins, under my armpit with this weird looking syringe. Although they didn't show any real reaction, I could tell they're surprised I'm awake. I couldn't move at all except for my eyes and lips. I was terrified, in sort of fight or flight mode, my heart pounding like an influx of adrenaline. I can't even begin to tell you how scared I felt. I was in total rage now though. I want to kill them. I wanted to rip out the device and destroy them. My brain went totally primal, just my animal instincts, and I could tell that they could sense my anger because they stepped away. I'm 6'3" and about 185 pounds, and I was hoping that I was looking threatening to them. Now, they appear almost harmless though. 2 of them disappeared from my view and presumably left the room. The other one was just staring at the void of any emotion. I so badly wanted to shut my eyes and force myself to sleep, but I wasn't able to. I was trying not to blink. Then 2 greys came back, and now they weren't alone. Honestly, I couldn't believe my eyes. Standing behind them were 2 very tall, human-looking beings, a male and female. Now, the males have dark blue eyes, and the females have violet. I suppose that those in the UFO community refer to them as Nordics. It was quite bizarre to me. My family descends from Sweden, and I'm quite Nordic looking with blonde hair and blue eyes. I know this is cliche, but I heard a feminine voice in my mind. For some reason, I couldn't understand what she was telling me, although it was something like, "Be calm, you're not in danger." I relaxed and asked her what she wanted me to do and what was going to happen. Apparently they were checking up on me. I practically black out after hearing that. I asked her what she meant. She said that they saved me from when I first come in the beginning. Now I knew what that meant. I was born 2 months premature, and my mum was unwell in labour, and we had fevers of 104. The strange thing is, the doctors had no idea what was wrong with us. I was given 2 spinal taps and my mother 3. I spent 4 nights in the ICU housing unit thing. There was a decent chance I wouldn't make it. Then one day I make a full recovery. The doctors were very worried the whole time that I might have permanent damage to my body and brain, but I was fine totally. I asked her why did she save me. I heard a male voice stating that this is a conversation for later. I say, "Are you human?" and he said no. I was confused considering that they look quite human. I asked him if they had come from here and he said yeah. Apparently they come from 200,000 years ago and created mankind by combining their DNA with that of our primitive ancestors. I wanted to know why they looked especially similar to me more than other humans. He stated that males of their kind found female humans attractive and apparently mated with them, and directly passed on their physical features to Nordic people. I want to know more, but they declined and said that it's time for me to go back. I black out immediately and wake up by a campfire which is put out. Now, I know it sounds very ridiculous and impossible, but it happened to me. I don't know what to do. I've been completely lost since the encounter, but I feel better by sharing my story. Now, I've struggled with my story for years, mostly because I couldn't believe what I saw. I never get too superstitious, but I'd be lying if I said that I'd never had any encounters with unexplainable things, and this one tops the list. I know people don't believe me, but my god, I'm being honest. I was camping with my Boy Scout troop in Alpine, New Jersey when I was in the 8th grade, I stepped out of the cabin in the middle of the night to go to the toilet and do my business. I stepped outside for a second, taken in the cabin sight. I was standing by a picnic table and glanced around. The moon was so bright that it made the sky look blue rather than dark, and there was a light fog ominously casting along the campsite. I then heard a rustling in some bushes and didn't react much at first, but it continued and got louder. Slowly, I moved my flashlight along until I get to the source of the sound as it got louder and louder. I looked over and I see this absolutely gigantic thing standing on its hind legs. He was tall and had a muscular body with fur that looks to be dark grey. He had the head of a wolf and dog, only thicker, and the weirdest part, yellow eyes. I stare at him and he stares back. He then just vanishes, ran away faster than I ever thought was possible. I was so bewildered that I blacked out for a minute and had to sit down, but when I went back to the cabin and tried to get asleep, I then realised that I'm really struggling to block it out of my mind until eventually it becomes a repressed memory. But I eventually find it resurfacing after watching an episode of Monster Quest about werewolves. This doesn't really bother me. Truthfully, I actually think it is pretty cool, almost like seeing something from a perfect horror movie. The funny thing is, I didn't feel like this thing didn't want me to see it or anything. It's as though we looked at each other and silently agreed to say nothing, to leave each other alone, and then act like nothing has happened. I personally don't buy into the transformation stuff with the moon, but maybe this is some kind of weird species that we don't know about. I don't know. Before I went to college, I befriended a professor of mathematics. He was one of the most intelligent, eloquent, and articulate people that I've ever known. A remarkable family man who married in his 20s with a daughter and a son. He never drank or smoked or used drugs, never permitted himself to curse or raise his voice or become agitated or aggressive. Even in disagreements, he's always in control, always punctual and on time, always organised and very disciplined. He wore clothing that would not make him look out of place for the 20th century and acted like a true gentleman. I'm just telling you what kind of person he was basically, so not a junkie or crazy person. Now, I had the pleasure of taking advanced algebra, Celsius 1, 2 and differential equations with him. Anyway, we had this STEM club room in the maths department where students would hang out and study and chat together. And sometimes our professor would join us and help for tutoring, homework or exam study, and just discusses other various unrelated topics. Once he tells us a story about what happened in the woods. This happened in the 90s when he was a teenager. He lives in Quincy, CA during that time. He had a hobby of driving his dad's old beat-up truck all over the Sierra Nevada mountains just for exploring and also hunting animals and gathering wild berries. He liked following old mining roads and seeing where they led. One such time, he was looking for berries to pick. It was getting late and the sun had set, so he was driving down this narrow road when there's an obstruction. He saw what appeared to be a stretched out giant plastic bag across the road. He thought that it might have been construction work or something and drove up to see what that is. He stops his vehicle within 40 feet of it and realizes that it's not a plastic bag. It was some kind of screen or curtain, a two-dimensional flat shape stretching over the road. Perpendicular to it, it was rectangular shape, with the width of the road about 1.5 meters in height, and he saw that it was somewhat translucent, kind of like a hologram. It was semi-transparent, because when my professor shined a flashlight through the rectangle, the light penetrated it, illuminating the road past it, but just barely, like light only went a foot or two beyond that screen. It was just standing or floating there, and yet it was not attached to anything. It held its own weight, but it was like weightless at the same time. Its surface was waving and rippling. My professor got out of the car to investigate the strange floating rectangle. He went right up to it. As he did, it was like emitting a vibration or low humming, which he can feel in his bones. There was an effect, actually, that was closer to the rectangle. The strongness of the vibration was actually having an effect on objects around it. As he got closer, he saw that the hair on his arms was standing up, like there was some kind of energy in the air. There were dense trees on each side of the road, so he couldn't go around this rectangle in the middle of the road. He went up to the trees and broke off a branch, and then poked the branch into this rectangle, and he saw subtle ripples going up and down through the rectangle from the place where he touches the surface. And he stuck the stick all the way into the rectangle and there was no resistance, but it didn't see the stick going through the other side of the rectangle. It basically disappears or becomes invisible. Then he pulled it over, and the stick was unchanged, not burnt or deformed. Not knowing what the rectangle was, he went back to his car and continually looked at the rectangle. He didn't want to risk driving through the rectangle, so put his car in reverse until the road became wide enough to turn around. To this day, he doesn't know what it was. It looked like a two-dimensional shape, like a semi-transparent rectangle stretched out across the road, perpendicular to the surface of the road. He didn't even know how it was possible for a two-dimensional shape to be floating in that way, but he saw it with his own eyes. I don't know if he ever went out there to find out, but he didn't elaborate. He didn't even say that he knew exactly what it was, that it was just something crazy that he couldn't explain. Now my family was out with some of their friends. They had a camper. We had a real big tent. It was a biggish site that we were at with a couple of large trails that came through to the end of the road. We were set up in a cove in the bushes on one side, and the camper van is parked on the other, so anybody walking those trails would walk between us. We spent the day having a good time riding some dirt bikes and then all headed to our respective sleeping areas, but I, as usual, have a hard time falling asleep. At around 2 AM, according to my phone, I look out the slightly see-through mesh of the tent and saw a branch or something across the trail from me illuminated. I spent a long time trying to figure out what it was, but the light never moved. The next thing I know for sure happened, and the footsteps, slow ponderous steps over the gravel road, and then walking around the perimeter of our tent, repeatedly. I just thought it was an inquisitive animal, but grew unnerved as the steps continued. The branch out of my little window was lit up. I started to drift off slightly, but was woken when I noticed that the steps had stopped, and the branch was no longer visible, but something worse was happening. Now, a few feet outside my mesh window, I could see a crouched motionless figure. It kind of reminds me of one of the Hetrics from Outcast 2. Now, a nude figure with branches around its head. I couldn't tell which way it was facing, and my night vision hadn't ever been the greatest, so I couldn't really see too well. Now, at some point, the figure is gone, and I was able to branch it again. Now, the next morning, all seems like normal. The first thing I did was look around for the source of the footsteps, but there was no gravel or packed dirt, which was weird. Eventually though, over breakfast, we discussed with everybody what had happened and about apparently seeing somebody. Allegedly others had seen this too. Apparently a single person or thing was walking from the trail at around 2:30ish with a flashlight. It wasn't any of us. Any other person would have had to walk miles to get to us. We decided it was someone crazy, but ultimately we don't know, and it really makes my skin crawl. I was camping at Heart Mountain Hot Springs, At 6:45 am, I was leaving my campsite, but I thought to use the nearest bathroom. The campsite sits above the field overlooking the road that runs west to other campsites, a field, creek, and 3 hot spring pools. As I walked out of my sight, I looked across the field and saw an animal. It was about 200 feet away. I think it's a wild horse, but there are no wild horses in the Heart Mountain National Antelope Range. This animal's body was facing me south, with its head turned slightly to its left. I thought it was a horse because it had a black mane of hair and its body was brown and shiny. It appeared to be the size of a yearling at first. I say first because later I saw a human man almost in the same place, and I believe the creature was 7 to 8 feet tall. It turned its head directly towards me, then it turned its body leftwards, which is east, and walked across the parking lot to the bridge across the creek, and I lose sight of it in the trees. It was bipedal. It did not move quietly. Now it moves very quickly though, going side to side, swinging. I later looked for footprints. The ground was too hardened to find any. I don't know what it was. My grandfather was a park service ranger, and he would always tell me these stories. Apparently, on the plot of land that he owned, there was some kind of weird figure that would appear every so often. Now, you couldn't ask him exactly what it was and get necessarily a clear answer, because it would change from time to time. He basically wasn't sure exactly what it was, and each time he would describe it different, usually using the different emotions of which he felt while spotting it. Exactly the same thing would happen with my grandma. Sometimes it was like this thing was angry, sometimes it was like it was hurting, sometimes it was like it was lonely, and sometimes it was like it was lost. But one thing was sure, they always reported seeing it, and it actually gone back to their parents and grandparents. Now apparently there was some kind of ancient burial site upon this land, and I didn't know about it until I got older. But allegedly, there have been multiple sightings of something tall, skeletal in appearance, which apparently would roam the land randomly. The first time of which it was sighted was near the small river and the lake that's on the back of their property. Apparently, it was seen virtually hovering across the water by my great-grandpa. Apparently he was hunting one day and stopped for a while to rest by it when he saw this thing. Apparently it scared him so much that he actually tried to fire shots at it. He said either he had the worst aim in the world that day, or that thing was some kind of spirit and the shots were going through it. He didn't know. He was so scared that he actually left his gun there. It was out of ammo by that point, but he wanted to get away as quick as possible and not necessarily carry any dead weight whatsoever. The next time it was spotted was by his wife a few years later. Apparently she was out trying to pick wild berries on their property one day when she could see a skeletal head staring at her from behind a tree. At first she thought it was some kind of animal that had died there many years ago and they hadn't realised, but then she said the thing moved. So weird sightings actually come from their guests too, and not only them. Even all the way up to my grandpa. Apparently my grandpa first realised it was there when he was there during one Christmas. And apparently he was out playing with some of the other kids and he noticed a strange gown. He said this time it was red in colour, which was weird because usually it appears as black. At first he thought it was a tree, or at least the stump of a tree, of which was different colour to the rest of the woods, until he realised it was moving and he can see a face. The way that he describes it, now God bless him, he doesn't have much knowledge of Star Wars, but he said it looked like one of the characters with 4 lightsabers. I can't remember the specific name, but you know the one when it's got its hood up, but if it was red. From the sounds of that story, I was pretty creeped out by my grandpa, but then he says there was more. Apparently, there was another time that he was playing with his friends, and he actually saw multiple of this thing. Weirdly, apparently it also had glowing orange eyes. That's how he noticed there was more than one. He can't say for absolute certain because it was quite dark at this time, but he's pretty convinced it was, and they weren't isolated incidents. Now, I actually spent a lot of time out of there. I ended up spending quite a lot of time to just get away from my parents. At least that's what I think they were doing. My grandparents had a lot of time to look after me, so I was often there. My memory of my grandparents was absolutely loving. Like, I honestly couldn't have asked for better grandparents who were more loving or caring. It's something I don't think I really appreciated so much when I was young, actually, because they were kind of always there. So it's something that I kind of got a better appreciation for and grasp as when they weren't here, which I always regretted. But anyway, so I remember taking some walks there during the summertime when I was a bit younger. I've grown up with these stories pretty much all my life, so probably about 8 or 9 out of 10 times that I'd actually go out there, I was half expecting to have some kind of horrifying encounter. Though it never really happened, I actually went out there multiple times with an overactive imagination, really wishing that something would happen to me. The stupidest thing I ever did was I actually called for it a few times. Now, I don't know why I actually did this, but again, nothing would happen. I remembered one specific day though when I was out there seemed to be some kind of haze up ahead. It was almost like there was a big filter and there was some kind of fog which wasn't there before suddenly over part of the scenery. I do think to myself that this is particularly weird. It's something I haven't seen before and my young mind can't comprehend it. I had a really weird feeling too. And strangely, there was some kind of static in the air which was making the fibres on my jumper stand up and also the hair on my arms and the hair on my head. I looked up, scared there was going to be a lightning strike. I've been told about them before. This was before you had the videos to watch on the internet, but I was aware of it. I think maybe they told me in school about it one day, but I digress. I did look up and there was no rain clouds whatsoever. So I think this is specifically weird. It's almost like I'd walked into some kind of electrical storm, of which there was no storm, just the electrical aspects of it. So this was a deeply weird moment. I kind of felt uncomfortable. I've looked up the feeling later on in life, and it's similar to what those experience when they're in the vicinity of infrasound. Just a deep unhappiness and feeling that something is off, where your mind and body can't comprehend what's happening. I remembered walking around for a while. I kind of wanted to see the Reaper thing. Every time I said the word Reaper, my grandpa would say, no, that's not it, no. But that's how I described it, and that's how it sounded. So yeah, I was looking for this thing constantly, but nothing would happen, so I headed back. I think this was really odd. I remembered when I got home, my grandparents asked what was wrong with my hair, and I said, I don't know, some kind of storm. They both looked at each other and my grandpa laughed. He knew there wasn't a storm. It was really nice and sunny outside. He thought I was just messing around or something, or had wore one of his hats and not said. He actually brought this up and I said, no, I'm serious. That's what it was. He then laughs and we go about our day. I constantly pester him though to learn more and more about the Reaper. He tells me not to call it that. He describes it as an entity, but I continue with my term. I say, how do you feel when it's there? What happens? He says, I don't know, you just kind of feel off, almost like you're being hunted, and you'll know when that thing is there. You feel like you're being watched. I've had it times where I could look up between two trees and there was something staring at me through them. As I locked eyes, my vision would go blurry, and there it would be, that horrible skeleton-looking thing. Apparently too, sometimes it would appear with more of a horse head, which actually sounded more scary to me. Whenever you actually got to where it was before, there was also a bad smell, allegedly. The thing that I wasn't too scared about though is that apparently it never actually harmed anyone or anything. Well, at least that's what I thought. Apparently, they had a pet dog there before which everybody loved. It was a really nice Labrador, and it would roam the land freely. However, one night, the The dog didn't come back and they start to panic a little bit. They think, oh god, what if this dog has actually gone into the river and drowned? Then one of the neighbours actually reported seeing something by it, and the description sounded like our dog or an animal very similar to it. So worried, we decide to head over and see what's wrong, my grandfather says. When they get there, they can only describe a scene out of a horror film. Apparently the dog was there, but it was entirely drained of blood, and there were some bite marks near its neck. I don't know what kind of creature could have possibly done that. I just knew that it was one that I did absolutely not want to encounter now or at any point in the future. So what did you do, Grandpa? I buried it, very deep in the ground. He said weirdly though, no flowers seemed to grow around there, or plants, or anything, not even moss. I now feel a little more unsettled and I start to sweat a little bit as I'm uncomfortable in my chair. I actually felt quite stressed out by hearing that. I can see by the look in my grandpa's face that he wishes that he didn't tell me that, and I was probably too young to hear it. He says, now son, listen to me, don't be scared to go out of there. Haven't seen it for years, it could have been anything. I mean, that was kind of a back in my day thing. Now you're probably safe out there. Yeah, great, I thought. I could not stop thinking about this thing. The problem was too, like I said, this is back in the day when that you can only really research things through libraries or actually seeing them and experiencing things. But again, I'm not going to go to the library. And why not explore? For a couple of weeks I actually refused to go out through the forest, but eventually the curiosity and inquisitive part of me took over, so I head out once more. I'm going down a trail and walking down quite a steep incline. My grandpa was supposed to repair stairs here, but he hasn't. Well, kind of more like board decking, but it's quite annoying really. I eventually make it down and I get my white shoes very dirty. I'm just going to wash them off in the lake later on though, I think. Now, as I continue down doing my exploring, I'm pretty convinced nothing is going to happen when I see something odd. I can see a hand moving behind a tree. It's a very white hand too at that. It almost looked impossibly white. Then the clouds move behind the sun and I can see that it's kind of like a dark yellow colour. That's odd. It looks extremely skinny. I thought maybe it was some kind of animal. It kind of looked more like a chicken leg, I guess, than anything. But I didn't dare get closer to it as I saw one of the thumbs moving. I'm now not sure if what I was looking at was some kind of caterpillar or something similar to that, as I start to make my slow retreat to get away from it. I think it's weird. Just as this happens, that weird static starts to pick up in the air again and I can taste a metallic thing in my mouth. I don't know what it is, but I have a cold sweat now, and I quickly head back to my grandpa's. I decided not to say what had happened because I wasn't likely to be allowed out again if I said that I've gone off exploring on my own without telling anyone. My excuse for going out there was something much different, so I knew it wouldn't necessarily sit well if they'd found out what had actually happened. So now, I just go to bed. But I can't stop thinking of it. There was just something odd about it. I had no idea what I'd seen at that time, and that part of me was eating me up. So I decided to do another adventure. Now this is the following day. I go to the exact spot where the hand is, and while I'm walking there, I can't get the possibilities out of my head. I wish I had somebody else there with me to go exploring with, but I think my grandpa's going to be annoyed if I tell him. He was also doing some work on the cars now. He'd actually made me promise him before that I wouldn't go out there too far on my own, and I made a promise and I wasn't going to break that because it would upset him. I was being brave though. I was just hoping I wouldn't end up like the dog. Now I make it to the exact tree where I saw the hand, and weirdly, some of the ground below it seems to have died. It's almost like you've got all these perfectly healthy trees everywhere, but suddenly, on this specific one, just where the hand was, it seems like it's just dead, like loose bark. and also the ground doesn't have any plants which seem to be surviving. I do check a couple of times to make sure that this is actually the exact same tree, and it turns out that it is, which again is super weird for me. I'm not sure what to think of it. I decide to explore further and further. Now I do this for quite a long time, because eventually the sun starts to set, and I now realise that it's time for me to get back. That's when I noticed something strange that I didn't before. There's some kind of pile of sticks in the ground that wasn't there before. I initially thought it was my grandpa making some kind of bonfire or something, so I'm actually more confident and happy in this moment. I'm expecting to see him and to go and say hello to him, and to have a little explore around together. Well, I get closer and closer and I realise that something is quite odd actually. It seems like this little pile is not sticks, they're bones. Now I don't know where these bones could have possibly come from. I go to pick one up, but I'm froze there for a second. Something just felt odd, and I have that strange feeling coming over me again. Like something is odd, and something bad might be about to happen. Now it sounds very similar to what my grandpa described, with the feelings of everything. And I notice this is strange. The pile was probably about 2 feet tall, and I thought that was extremely weird. I then head back. I don't get too far back when I hear some kind of language spoke. I thought maybe it was somebody from a foreign place, but it sounds different. It's almost like very loud deep sounds in a quick succession which then stop, and some kind of growling type sound. I'm froze there trying to see where this is coming from, and I just cannot find it. Now, I decide to turn away from this. I don't want to scare myself. It's getting dark and I'm not far away from getting in trouble with my grandpa and my grandma and my parents, and I don't want to have to suffer the consequences of that. So I continue bounding along until I'm halfway back. I don't hear the sounds again, but I think this is rather odd. Then, as I'm halfway back, I see something from behind a tree, which I can't describe. Somebody steps out, who I'd have to describe as about 7 feet tall, wearing a very flowing gown. And I look up, and I can see dark holes where eyes are supposed to be, and I see the face of a skeleton, and something animated moving around with it. It's not moving normally, it's kind of dancing, zigzagging from side to side, almost like it's glitching for a second. I say, huh? I say grandpa, thinking that it's him somehow, but it isn't. I look around and everything seems so dark, and it sounds like a storm's about to pick up. I'm froze there for a while, as this thing seems to slowly edge towards me. It's very hard to tell what direction that it's actually going in, because it kind of moves backwards before it goes forward. I decide to walk further down. I'm actually closer to home this way to see if this thing's following me, and it seems to. I was honestly awestruck by this. I didn't immediately connect the dots of what I was seeing to what my grandpa had described before, and other members of my family, but I moved down a bit further now. This thing was moving extremely slow. I mean, probably like quarter of my walking speed. For a good 5 or 10 minutes, I kept changing directions to see if this thing would stop following me, but it wasn't. It was getting closer and I didn't realise it at first, until I can see more and more detail. This thing looked just like the Reaper, just as I thought, and now the cards all fell on me at once. I scream and start running, and just like in your dreams, I seem to run extremely slow. I don't know where this was actually, I still don't to this day, but my legs were probably so scared that I couldn't run with any kind of pace whatsoever. So I'm left there trying desperately to get away from this thing, going slow as anything, and I seem to be not going much quicker myself. I heard snapping sounds now too. They're very loud, almost like gunshots, but it sounded like something was snapping in half constantly. I eventually make it back towards where my grandparents' house is. I was absolutely covered in sweat. And my grandma finds me and then says, "God, did you go swimming?" I say no, and I can't let out the words. I eventually get back in and she punishes me and tells me off for going swimming in the lake. I get told to bath off quickly and that I better explain to my grandpa why I was swimming out there. I'm stuck in the bath, literally shivering. It was a hot bath too. That's how scared I was. When I saw my grandpa, I actually didn't have the heart to tell him what I was doing and what I saw. It wasn't until months later that I could actually reveal what happened and why I wouldn't go out of the house and why I was so scared that night. He then looks at me and says, "I know what you saw, son, just please don't go out there again." And I agreed. I never did. Eventually I got older and completely forgot about the experience. That was until I had a bad dream which reminded me of it. I don't actually believe the Reaper's a real thing, but I don't know how else to describe what I saw that day. I want you guys to let me know what you think it could have been. I don't know if my incidents were isolated too, but I'm really having nightmares about it again and I want them to stop. I want to get closure to this. I was a child about 10 years of age when this encounter happened. I forgot about it until recently a dream sparked my memory. I was camping with my family in the mountains outside of my sweet home. I was doing what all the children do when camping and explore the area, generally following by the river, which is nearby. When I come upon a section of river with two steep banks separated by a ravine cut off by the river, I vaguely remembered looking across to the opposite side of the river and saw a couple of pale, emaciated looking people with pointy ears looking up the steep embankment, going up on all fours. I remembered wanting to jump across to try and get a better look, but being really creeped out at the same time. It was very surreal. Even now it's a hazy memory. I don't remember them wearing any clothes too, but they may have had some kind of loin clothing. I didn't see their faces because I only noticed them as they're going away from me and not facing me. They've got no hair or fur whatsoever. I don't know what to think of this. It happened in the mid-90s. Now I've had this story for 6 years, and I haven't really spoke about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful, and we're able to drive through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere. Absolutely nobody's around. We set up camp the next day and we went hiking, soaked up in the hot springs and come back and had dinner. It's all very normal until the next day. Now I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. Before we go to sleep, I put our food cooler and a stereo that we brought into the car and lock it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far right side of the tent away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest to the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning and I felt fine. I had slept hard and from inside the tent everything seems normal. We get out. Our campsite was in absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown over and things are scattered everywhere. Even the stereo was smashed to pieces laying next to a tree. All of the car doors are open including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence just taking everything in. The woods fell off now. It was quiet. And not really the beautiful place that we saw yesterday. Everything feels wrong now. My ex accuses me of not locking the door the night before, and that an animal got our stuff, but I promised that I locked it. I then go back into the tent to get the keys from my backpack, but they aren't there. I then found them later on the ground next to the car. We quickly throw everything into the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that night he had a dream that somebody was kneeling over him holding a gun, just staring at him. When I tried to question him more, he said he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't speak about it anymore. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something wrong happened to us those nights in the woods then, and I just cannot explain it. One of the weirdest stories I've ever heard happened is not my own, but my father's. My father works as a forest service worker, and he had many weird encounters over his years. This one in particular gave me chills all throughout my childhood, and it made me constantly just question things. Now, I'll tell this exactly how my father's told me and how that he's wrote it down for me, so sit back and enjoy. I think it's truly bizarre. Now, to start out, everything's going pretty well in life. I'm happy and my wife is now pregnant. Now this is going to be our second child. We already had our other one who's about 1 now, and we're really excited to have a second. We had a boy and we were hoping for another girl. It turned out that we had another boy, but that was just as much joy into our lives. Those who haven't experienced parenthood don't understand how it changes your life sometimes, and how it changes your approach to taking risks. I know that I certainly had the same feeling too. Now, where I was based at for my job, I didn't really encounter anything too heavy. I hadn't been working this role for that many years, and there was other more experienced guys out there. In fact, a lot of the time I'd actually get quite frustrated because I really truly wanted to do more, but I just wasn't able to. Sometimes there would be things that the other guys would know that I could do, and they would just rush off to do it before I had the chance to, and it was so frustrating. I enjoyed being out there, don't get me wrong, but I was kind of stuck doing more computer stuff and just, I guess, the boring things. Now, at this place, I knew that I could progress, but it was going to take years. They basically offered me all the training and everything, but my god, it was slow. The thing was, I was probably smarter than all of the people there, just not being given any opportunities that I needed to progress. It was almost like they'd given me this form, and it said everything I needed to do, but there were holes in it that they couldn't see, and it made me feel really uncomfortable. I was quite tempted to join the Navy. I actually wanted to become a Navy SEAL at the time. It wasn't really possible because of some of the injuries I had, but I know that if I really pushed myself, I probably could have overcome them. But the problem was, even sometimes when I was doing this job, even just hiking around and doing my normal things, I would have a pain that I couldn't seem to stop from the bottom of my foot. I actually still have issues with it today. I'm not quite sure why it started, but yeah, it's just something I get on with. So on this particular day, it was just the same. There was more exciting call-outs and things to go and do, but literally before I could even get to the radio to say I would do it, someone would say I'm on it and would already be up there with their coffee in their hand, taking the last sips of their coffee before flying on out the door and to go and have all the fun. Yeah, it kind of really sucked doing this, but I guess it gave me more time to think and just relax a bit. The problem is, if you're like me, that time very quickly lends to boredom. I started going through some of the records and some of the reports. I basically had to reorganize them because some people in this office area, they would just throw everything onto a desk and not do anything. They would only look for items if they needed it, which of course is a very stupid idea and wastes everyone's time, but back in my day, I guess that's how it was. So I start reading through some reports. There was a few pretty creepy things on there. Some people would say that they had a feeling, like an intense feeling of fear that they couldn't describe, accompanied by a knocking on some of the trees. They were never able to locate the source of this sound, and they thought it was just animals, but it came up quite often over the years. Then I heard a really strange one. Apparently, there was a ranger that worked here, and a lot of the other people thought that he was going crazy. I was reading a second-hand account of what had happened to him. Apparently, Something had spoke to him and told him the future. Weirdly though, when I looked back through another account which was more recent than that one, some of the things that he said actually come true, and the person making the report actually noted that and how weird it was. Upon further investigation, it turned out that this person thought that he had spoke to beings or something. I don't know, kind of like aliens? They didn't describe it very well, just very vaguely. Now it seems like many of these cases were dismissed. There were other weird things too, like a specific area where you'd feel very hot, completely unnaturally, to the point that you'd actually question if there was some kind of hot spring there, or something weird that shouldn't have been there, but again, they could never find the source of it. The thing that made this even more bizarre is that eventually the plants and trees and everything in the area would start to die, so you basically knew for certain that something was definitely off there. Now I decided that I had to get out and do the very minimum just to not be in the office, and that's what I did. I remembered setting out and I was being a little bit more paranoid than normal. I think all these stories were just playing in my head. I remembered I kept thinking that I saw something walking through the tree line above ahead of me, always maintaining the higher ground. It kind of just trailed alongside me. It's really hard to describe, but was truly creepy. Now I don't know what it was, but I think it was some kind of large animal there. Not big enough to be a bear, but certainly weird. I did think maybe it was a hiker out there, but it wasn't possible. I thought that was bizarre. I remember thinking to myself that you've just learnt the power of human potential in the mind, and it was pretty scary to me. Now, life goes on. We probably get to about a month or 6 weeks in, and again, they're just not training me properly. It's kind of really annoying because they'll complain at me for doing something when it's exactly how somebody's told me to do it. And they'll say, oh no, just do it confidently. But then they'll say, why did you do that? And you'll explain that's how you're trained, and they wouldn't seem to listen, and it was kind of like a hostile group. I didn't end up staying there for too long, but I'll get to that later. So what do? Once again, get reserved to balancing the books and just doing the normal work. Now this is actually at a time before we had computers, so it did make days very boring too. The problem I found is that some people just did not have good handwriting. I've never been the best at reading others' handwriting, but especially in these situations, my god, it was like some of these people had honestly made an effort to write as illegible as possible. And again, if you can't read it, they complain, so I kind of become an expert of reading these things eventually. And again, every so often there's weird reports. I realise too, quite often when it's recorded, people just think, oh, it's the other guy not paying attention. Maybe he wants everyone to look at him and stuff like that. At least that's on the report conclusion, but I had a feeling that something was off when I kept on seeing the reportings of some kind of beings out there. This spanned over a number of years too, and long before I was there. They all seemed to be described as relatively the same. They called them the forest walkers. Apparently they seemed to be quite tall, and they would walk in almost a weird limp motion. The weird thing is that they would be silent too, and if you approached them, weird things would happen. Some people said they felt almost like they were high. Others said that they would just know things they couldn't have otherwise and stuff like that. I don't know if I believe in the supernatural that much, or at least at the time I didn't, but I just considered that these were just things that happen when you've been out in the woods for too long by yourself. Now eventually as time increased, and I started complaining to the higher ups about the issues I was having, I started to get out more and do more interesting things. I even got to rescue a few people too, which is a really cool feeling. I don't know if you've ever experienced it before, but there's something so cool about knowing that you preserved human life. You stepped in and you made a big difference and impact for someone. It's not something I'd felt before in other jobs too, so I was quite happy. Now, as I go out for a patrol one evening, I remembered having a strange feeling that the air was different. There was almost some kind of metallic smell that I couldn't quite describe. I was concerned that I had some kind of illness or that I accidentally got something on my nose, but No matter how much I wipe my nose, I can't seem to get rid of the feeling. And there was almost some kind of static in the air. You know, like when you have static electric and just before you feel the buzz, it was kind of like that. Now that's when I feel something. I can tell something's looking at me and I stop to turn around and see what it is. And then I can make out some kind of figure. It's probably about 20 feet away. It's wearing kind of like a dark coloured robe, but when it gets closer it appears more white. It walks with a weird limp and I can't believe my eyes. I actually rub my eyes quickly, not sure for a second if I'm dreaming, and it's gone. Now I think this is pretty creepy. I want to figure out what this is, so filled with excitement I actually jogged towards where it was. Now I couldn't tell you too much else about it, but just that it completely vanished. I probably spent another hour myself actually searching the surrounding areas just to see if I could find something, anything there to explain what I'd just seen, but alas, I come up blank. There's nothing there but myself. Now I'm actually a little bit irritated because I don't want to seem stupid. I really don't want to become like one of the people whose stories I've read, probably to be dismissed later on the same way that I dismissed some of theirs. But currently, it seems like I'm going to have no option but for that to be the case for myself. Yeah, it sucked really. I go back eventually and tell them what happened. Now, no one believes me, which is what I expected, and they say, yeah, you're too junior to be going out there and investigating things like this. I was pretty fed up again. I come from a role before where I was very well respected, and honestly, the way I was being treated was really annoying me. Now, a few months go on, and it becomes winter, and the going gets a little bit more tough really. It was pretty cold out there. I mean, uncomfortably so for myself. Now, I remembered on one particular day, I can't tell you specifically what I was doing, I just remembered that I was out there, that I spotted something weird, I mean really bizarre. There were these small figures, kind of limping around in the woods, again silently. Now I can't believe what I'm seeing. They're probably about 5 feet tall now, and in more of a white coloured gown kind of thing. Like I said, I didn't know what this was. I thought maybe it was something from Halloween, like decorations people put out there. And I actually wasn't too scared now. I was convinced that this wasn't actually a real thing or threat or danger, so I decided to sit back and very slowly follow these things. Now I didn't look behind myself, so there could have been more, but these things just kept on marching on, kind of down the path for a good 10 minutes longer. Now they never once seemed to notice me or so much as turn around, so again, I'm still not entirely sure what I'm seeing, but I think it's some kind of Halloween decoration that someone's playing around with. I don't know, it could be a cult, it could be anything, but I'm not too worried. I don't know if it was the size of them or what, but I just wasn't concerned. Also, there seemed to be nature interacting normally around, so that meant that these things weren't a threat, at least I thought. So this continues on until eventually they all stop at something. I stop too, and I can see about 4 of them. I was incredibly curious as to what they were looking at, but there's no real way for me to be able to see where I'm based currently. I get closer and closer and realise that I'm going to have to take the long way round now to figure out what it is. I decide to take a stealthy approach and I try and walk very slowly through the foliage and get around. I do make it to a pretty good horizon and I can see in front, and I still can't figure out what they're looking at. Now I'm sure these are people now, so I become a little bit more confident and I walk down even closer to where they are. Eventually, I ended up crashing through some of the brush and I decide that I'm going to be more present now. Obviously these people know that I'm here, so what's the point of trying to hide away from them? I go a little bit quicker now and eventually go round to where I think that they're facing, and I can't see their actual faces. It's kind of just dark where that their faces are completely covered up in something. Now I crouch down to get a better look at them, and suddenly, I can hear voices in my head. They don't sound like voices I ever heard before too, and it's almost like my own voice but different. And I keep hearing different things that haven't happened yet. I hear about the birth of my son and know that it's going to be a boy. I know exactly what he's going to look like, how my career's going to go, what my wife's going to do, and some of the hardships that come up and who's going to pass away in my family. It actually makes me incredibly emotional at this point, and I almost feel like it's too much and start to cry a bit. I ended up kind of just becoming overwhelmed with my emotions, and I fall back into the dirt and stare up at the sky. The sky's very bright today, and it actually looks quite nice. After a moment, I kind of stop hearing the voices so much. They kind of just slowly fade out, like somebody slowly turning down the volume on a record, and I get up. I realise now that whatever these things are has gone now, and I'm just here alone, very confused as to what's actually just happened to me. I get up, and I'm sure there's going to be an explanation for this. I ended up scouring around for probably another hour and a half until I conclude that nothing's here. That's when my panic finally catches up with me, and I decide that I need to get back as quick as possible. I start making my way there. I eventually get back to the station and immediately write down my report. I didn't speak to anybody else about what had happened, and that's when I'm confused. I suddenly realised that what I was reading was very similar to some of the reports of what had happened years before. The ones where that people had considered the guys that were reporting it a little bit crazy or seeing things. And for that reason, I actually took the report and ended up throwing it into the trash. I didn't want my colleagues to think I was crazy. I mean, I didn't like most of them to begin with. I knew that this was going to hurt me moving on to the other areas that I wanted to work, so there was going to be no benefit of me actually posting this. Now, I ended up moving on and working as a ranger in different areas and doing different kinds of roles too, even being a fire service worker. Now, here's the weird thing. I only realised it much later, but I did have a son, and he looked exactly like I knew he would. The job that I changed into is exactly what I heard I would. My wife's role too. Also, some family members that died, they were the exact people who I was told would do so as well. Now suddenly, I felt kind of a weird fear come over me, almost like a wash and flood of emotions coming back, realising that something had contacted me back then, and for whatever reason wanted me to know what was going to happen. I can't put my finger on why this happened or how it happened to me. I just know what I saw was real, and that I wasn't the only person that saw those kinds of things out there. Lots of my other colleagues had experienced some very similar things, and I just don't know what to make of it all.